Thank you, Mirna, for the kind introduction. As everyone said, we live in a world, and some of us live in bodies where at times it feels like we have no words for what we go through. So I wasn't sure whether to come today and be here, and on some level giving a presentation while many of your loved ones and family members are living through war feels almost surreal and even inappropriate. But I'm not alone. And yet, I'm here precisely because of that. A friend from Catalonia, where I live these days, wrote to me yesterday morning, and they sent love and wished safety for my loved ones. He also told me that they hadn't reached out earlier the past months because they simply had no words. And that stayed with me, and it made me realize that even when words fail us, we still have one another, and perhaps that is why I think this work that I've done with my community and work that centers on words and language itself feels so important to me right now. And I just want to say I don't stand here as a symbol and nor as an attempt to make any of this feel normal. And I'm here because continuing to think, speak, and gather matters, especially now. So I'm with many emotions now, and I'm also happy to be here in such great company of thinkers. And thank you to everyone at Sonic Acts who made this gathering possible, including the volunteers, technicians, cleaners, and all the smaller, more invisible hands and feet involved in holding this space. I also want to thank the Ateliers for hosting me and its participants during this past month in Amsterdam, where, as Mirna mentioned, I've been doing a writing residency. And thanks to all of you for being here on a Sunday noon, and finally thanks to myself and Iranian friends and all the siblings in the room who made it here through war, climate crisis, genocide, the list is long, because it's not easy to be here on a public stage, and it is not enough. So what I'm going to share with you in many ways is an unfolding research, kind of a generative chaos. So some of the slides you will see might not relate to what I say, so you can choose either to read them, to look at them, or not, or just to listen, follow my voice. So my research is about Maram-Nameh, which I offer as a kind of contribution to the community I'm part of. Maram-Nameh is a Farsi or Persian term without a direct English equivalent. It could be translated as a book of ways of relating, or a text of ethical attunement, perhaps even a code of conduct. But unlike prescriptive codes, it is not a fixed document. It is less a rule book than a shared relational, processual, and collectively negotiated rhythm and space. And all of this is not meant to be just beautiful and poetic, as I will explain. I have been working on the Maram-Nameh within the Khamoosh community, of which I am a member. But before unpacking these words further, I want to situate my research and this presentation within a particular linguistic and conceptual framework that comes from the Farsi affix ham. Ham. So I'm not talking about cured pig leg, nor ham radio, though radio might indeed feel closer to this conversation. But I'm referring to the affix ham in Farsi. Ham can function as prefix, suffix, and sometimes even infix and circumfix, which basically means it can accompany a word at any junction to create another word. So the closest translation in English might be with, or co as in co-making, or overlaying. So for example, hamsar is literally overlaying heads, and it's the word for a partner or spouse. Or hamra is overlaying paths, meaning someone who accompanies you materially on a path, or attunes with an idea and supports you. Darham is from kind of inside overlaying, which is the word for messy. Or hamsada, which is overlaying of sounds, which is one of the words for solidarity or support. and many more. In all these examples, Ham suggests more than one addition. It somehow creates a third meaning through overlaying. It is not merely collective in the sense of many units, but it implies a relational field where something emerges between actors. So I became particularly interested in Ham through encountering the word Hamistan, used in wetlands restoration practices in northern Iran, where I came across it for the first time. It points to a shared temporality, not necessarily doing things at the same time, nor simply at the right time, but attuning to one another within collective environmental practice. It involves improvisation, coincidence, failure, noticing. A collective rhythm that can overlay temporalities in the direction of achieving shared values. Since in Farsi there is actually no single unified word that directly corresponds to the English concept of community, and instead there are many situation-based terms that can be used depending on the context, I recently discovered that this particular word actually also historically exists as a noun meaning community in a more general sense. Anyway, I begin with this because I think I want to situate my research and my writing within such a Ham context in relation to Khamoosh community, which I will explain in a bit more about. But interestingly, Ham also means as well, or to. So here my research and what I refer to as a research is not a critical apparatus studying Khamoosh community from outside, nor an immersed proximity, nor a forensic solidarity endeavor. It is an attempt to overlay these contexts. So that includes my own role in this community and my practice, including, as Mina mentioned, my part-time PhD student in music, which comes with its own privileges, not finances in my case, but of time and knowledge and mentorship. And also my daily labor as a freelance artist, negotiating immigration requirements, and even to some extent, the domestic work of a housewife, as taboo as that might sound, or khanadar in Farsi, a homekeeper. So I'm saying because this research also includes these less visible temporalities of everyday life, entailing emotional labor, ongoing conversations, possibility makings and learnings as an Iranian woman living in Europe in this very moment, carrying with them an ironic discomfort with identity politics and a complicated relation to belonging and home. All of this coexists without reducing one to the other. It is part of my research and it is not an autoethnography, because let's face it, in some way any research is autoethnographic, and surprise, distance is not neutral, and there is no objective position. And so already from the very get-go, the languages we speak and the references we cite and how our own positionality define our research, both in ways in which it is defined and how it is implemented. So translation of words here is not meant to reappropriate and favor the dominant language and platform, but to be reread, translated, and spoken in other languages and contexts. And I'm inspired to think along linguists and thinkers like Yasnaya Aguilera and Carlos Lenkersdorf to see language not as a tool to communicate what we already know, but to explore what we yet don't know. So this residency in this month became as much about cooking and gathering as writing. I hope that doesn't sound disappointing. And with an unexpected amount of hanging out with my old friends from Iran, some of who I reunited after many years, and one of whom I actually just bumped into on streets of Amsterdam in my first week. And as well, new friends based in Amsterdam. During my residency at Woonhuis, I have been also in conversation with the Ateliers participants as a guest tutor, doing a writing workshop on the 19th of February with some of the participants and the wider public. So some of the words that you have been reading on the screen so far and will be reading have been written by different contributors during this workshop, for which I'm quite grateful, in languages in Ukrainian, Belarusian, Cantonese, Mandarin, Uyghur, Farsi, Arabic, just to name a few. And this is a kind of also diary of my residency with people who came to stay with me to share tea or to co-work because the building was so big that I couldn't be there alone. So I emphasize these encounters because, as mentioned, they are not interruptions to research and writing. They are its conditions of possibility. And writing here is not a solitary production, but it is social, temporal, and layered. And within such understanding, writing about and working on Maram-Nameh starts to negotiate the binaries of reader, writer, or the researcher, the researched, or the listener and the listened to. Alongside these encounters, I was also guided by poetry and by a particular Farsi thesaurus that organizes words as spectrums rather than fixed entries, suggested to me by Khorshid Parsi, who leads the glossary project of Khamoosh community. Each word is defined within a spectrum of meanings folded into one another. Meaning emerges not as a stable definition, but within relational span, like conversation and listening. These spectrums overlap and create new meanings, and sometimes new actions. So Maram-Nameh is made of two words, Maram and Nameh. Maram is difficult to translate. A few days ago, while writing these lines, I came across something on social media that in a simple way illustrated it. Someone had thrown a pomegranate into a passing car, a spontaneous gesture. The person who received it later posted that even though they might never meet again, the kindness of that moment has been sustaining them in recent days. I thought perhaps this is Maram. Maram is a quality of being marked by giving without expectancy, not generosity as a moral superiority, but an orientation. Doing something because it feels aligned, because it sustains relation, without calculating return. It suggests an ethical attunement to others, a way of being with. But it does not sit within the realm of intellectual or poetry, as it somehow sounds like when I talk about it in English, but it actually comes from a non-academic context and street culture, a culture of ayyari, a culture of yarigari, comradeship, companionship, brotherhood and sisterhood. So as poetic as it sounds, it is not a metaphoric nor romantic concept. Within its semantic spectrum, Maram can also refer to intention, aim, disposition, inner orientation. It carries both directionality and character, what one moves toward and how one moves toward it. It is not only what we do, but also about the texture of how we do it. And Nameh literally means letter, but it can also be a written document, a text addressed to someone. So Maram-Nameh could be understood as a letter of ethical orientation, or a collectively structured text that articulates how Maram unfolds within a group. It is not exactly code of conduct nor manifesto, which I found are words that people somehow reflect back to me when I talk about Maram-Nameh. And so even though that Nameh implies a textual written book, Nameh perhaps is not so much associated with a published book necessarily. It is closer to a zine, a living document, a negotiated set of relational gestures that are written and can be open to be changed. It can be read out loud or listened to as well, perhaps. As I have mentioned but not yet explained, this word and this work emerges from my involvement in a community-based practice called Khamoosh. So perhaps now, before going any further, I need to tell you a bit about what Khamoosh is. And now I'm going to read from the collective proposal of Khamoosh. Khamoosh is a participatory transdisciplinary research community that mediates conservation and restoration by exploring the sonic heritage of Iran through recorded sounds of everyday life, sounds less heard or even silenced. And this process-based project aims to build an interactive archive of sounds and to exchange, resurrect, and decolonize these sounds using artistic methods. Our methodology is guided by an ongoing process of learning by doing, community-based participation, collective artistic practice, and research as a network. So Khamoosh is interpreted as silence in Farsi. However, it is a notion in Iranian poetry and culture that points to a spiritual experience that goes beyond silence as the absence of sounds. This notion, described by many Persian poets, entails attentive listening, presence, and avoidance of unnecessary action. So yeah, these are some of the poetry using this word Khamoosh. And now I'm going to go back to talk more about Khamoosh from my own perspective. So Khamoosh began in July 2021 as a proposal titled Every Day for the HairMap Artistic Research Residency Program. At the time, the residency represented a rare opportunity in Iran. Funded artistic research residencies of this kind, of any kind, are uncommon, if not non-existent. The open call sought projects that would preserve and revalue tangible and intangible cultural heritage by developing new modes of perception, reception, and communication. This framework seemed an ideal context for proposing an approach to musical heritage through the sounds of everyday life and proposing to use the budget to form a community rather than an artwork, and focusing on what exists in the in-between spaces that are often excluded from definitions of heritage and adopting a kind of more bottom-up approach. And to be honest, I think we were, and in many ways, we still are confused, or rather skeptical. We found ourselves repeatedly returning to basic questions. So what is heritage? What is language? What is sound? And what is preservation? What requires protection, and who decides? Through a series of collective writings and mind mappings and letters, گفتمان نظری, theoretical conversations, we tried to unpack these terms together in the first year of our community formation. Those conversations were not conclusive. They were intriguing, frictional, and at times contradictory, leading to more questions. But perhaps that confusion allowed us to notice how inherited definitions carry institutional, nationalist, and disciplinary assumptions, and how different ways of listening might reinforce or unsettle them. And here I want to say also something that is implicit for me, but I think it's important to articulate, that this presentation is speaking both to you here and to members of Khamoosh. Some of them are present in this room, but most of them are based in Iran. In that sense, this is also a report back or a reflection. I am attempting to overlay my own thinking, developed within this residency and this academic or artistic context or whatever, with the ongoing work of the community in a non-linear way. And in this sense of, in this space of overlaying of hamkari, I hope that what I am shaping here feeds into the collective process again, rather than explaining about it, if that makes sense. So there are many words and concepts in our original proposal and many experiences that we've been revisiting and questioning, attempting to redefine. And I think this revisiting and this redefining is perhaps part of what our Maram-Nameh could look like. In Khamoosh, we felt the need for something that could be shared with new members of the community, a way of addressing misconceptions, misunderstandings that otherwise required long conversations to untangle. We began imagining a context that could function as an alternative to hours of explanation. This was kind of a trigger for looking for something that led us to Maram-Nameh. The suggestion for this word emerged from the glossary group. At the time, we did not know that Maram-Nameh existed historically. It simply felt right, familiar, and clear for a Persian-speaking context. However, at the first opening of Sonic Acts, when I was sharing a sound piece in the listening room, the familiarity of Morq Haq, the bird of justice, or Eurasian Scopes owl, prompted something to be whispered in my ear from someone in the audience, and she recognized the bird and told me its Farsi name, which is like bird of justice. Her name is Rayhan Ebrahimi. And we began speaking. Within a few minutes, I discovered that the word Maram-Nameh, which we had been using intuitively within Khamoosh and which felt right to us, actually exists in contemporary Iranian history. She shared with me a Maram-Nameh preserved in her family, a document from a secret women's society dated exactly 100 years ago, February 1926. It was followed by a Nizam-Nameh, which is a statute or organizational framework more similar to code of conduct. And the Maram-Nameh was brief and dense. One section focused on determination and labor and sacrifice in creating conditions for women's rights and freedom in Iran. Another insisted that members must work diligently, but only up to the point where no harm is caused to others. On its first page was a note in the name of a Hamdel society, a society of overlaying hearts, which is one of the words for empathy. And so we are now hearing also like Behdokht Roshdieh, Rayhan's mother, reading this historical Maram-Nameh to us and to also members of Khamoosh. And this encounter shifted something. It reminded me that we are not inventing from nothing. We are resonating with longer, often hidden genealogies of collective organization in Iran. And through this research, I began accessing a broader linguist and literary field around yarigari, literally ways of friendship or ways of collaboration. These are local, self-organized, people-run forms of mutual aid and cooperative survival. Within this culture, yarigari, as demonstrated in this book, is understood as an active social interaction grounded in reciprocal communication, occurring between two or more actors, oriented towards shared or overlapping objectives, functioning as peyvand dahande, binding or interdependent, and capable of resurfacing in different forms depending on context and conditions. So collaboration here is not mere participation, it is relational binding. So within such a context, what might the Maram-Nameh of Khamoosh as an archive-making project look like? Our archive is not simply a collection, it is bastarsazi or context mating. We operate horizontally, privileging tasheelgari or facilitation over management. Our methodology is shaped partly by precarity. The archive becomes not only a record of sounds, but a record of relationships, of ecological and emotional entanglements, and I might use cautiously the word mutual care. Restoration then is not reconstruction. Preservation is not the storage of an intact treasury. Restoration becomes a resonance. And this is not in the metaphoric realm. It is also practiced, rehearsed, and tested materially and emotionally. And alongside recording sounds, we record ways of listening and holding space together. So in this sense, the Maram-Nameh is quite practical. At its core, it functions as a space for processes that are often excluded from social gatherings. These include, to name a few, being tired, grieving, navigating confusion, navigating injustices, getting closer to interspecies connections, attending to silenced struggles, dealing with distortions, and over-amplification of voices shaped by ideologies and at times propaganda. So to transit into some sort of conclusion here, or just to organize the chaos here, I can summarize like this research into three trajectories. So the first is a lexicon for Maram-Nameh. So through conversations with Khamoosh members and through collective exercises, we began gathering words. So during the workshop on the 19th, I invited participants to reflect on possible words for a Maram-Nameh using a technique I recently learned from Carol Stampone, inspired by this concept of Afro-Brazilian philosopher escrevivencia, which means like you kind of allow writing to shape your life, and in your writing you also go back to your lived experience. And so many of these words clustered, and they formed constellations, and some of which you have been reading through this presentation. So the Maram-Nameh incorporates entries in Farsi, English, and other tongues we carry, especially borrowing words from our glossary project, which explores endangered and silenced languages, the loss of terms that once held sonic and communal cosmologies. How might silence become a resource, a strategy, a companion in our collective movement toward reparation? So Maram-Nameh is not only written, it is sonic. Orality, voice, friction, noise, birdsong. These are not illustrations of text, but extensions of it. Part of the contribution here is to unsettle the separation between reading and listening, to understand both as a lived and relational act. In our research on sonic conceptions, for instance, we encountered bells whose tones resemble spoken words, potential headlines for sections of Maram-Nameh, words and their wordings, and how language itself generates realities. We became attentive not only to words, but to the worlds they produce. If language is itself a living cultural ecology, what does thinking through our languages allow us to perceive this differently? And Iran alone contains close to 200 spoken languages, many endangered. With them, sonic vocabularies disappear, and silence accumulates. So the third trajectory is inspired by disability justice scholars, and I have been thinking with Johanna Hedva along her lines, what about stories enlivened, not despite illness, trauma, or interruption, but because of them? And how might nonlinearity, maintenance, and ongoing repair shape our ways of making Maram together? So improvisation here is not lack of structure. It is an ethical stance shaped by instability and collective adaptation. How can improvisation function as both methodological tool and ethical position within unstable conditions? What does it mean to nest communal research temporally, emotionally, and materially within ongoing processes of maintenance and repair? And in what ways might nesting and improvisation reflect disability-informed temporalities, slower, cyclic, interrupted, and contingent rhythms of gathering? And this is a more underdeveloped part, but I hope to focus on it more. And I also want to acknowledge that this presentation has not been so accessible, but I'm aiming to rethink it and share it in a more accessible way. So perhaps the outcomes for now is to understand Maram-Nameh as something to return to with new questions, asking whether it can create space for restoration as resonance rather than repair, whether our archive can mean relation rather than storage, whether our methodology can remain permeable to interruption. And maybe most importantly, whether we can design forms of working together that make space not only for productivity and clarity, but also for fatigue, doubt, grief, slowness, for the tempos that dominant ways of organizing often erase, or at least not sure how to practice. So I do not propose to offer Maram-Nameh as a model to replicate necessarily. I suggest we offer it as a question that can be carried elsewhere. What would a letter of ethical attunement look like in your context? What are the words that need to be overlaid or dismantled where you are? What silences are methodological and which are imposed? So if this presentation has been a bit nonlinear, it is because the process is. And perhaps this is part of its integrity. Yeah, thank you for listening.